All right, we'll start this one a little bit different. We're here with Goofy, Moose, and Ponch. So we got three characters on our show. I do want to start off the way we previously started off, but not everybody here on the show knows that. And that is, what's the simplest way to explain John Boyd's OODA Loop to your kids? Well, I don't know how to do that. So I'll tell you how I'm talking about it now. The purpose of it, starting with the what, is really to for an agent to take some kind of action on the environment. And the how they do that is we go through this whirl of reorientation, where we build off of our genetics, our culture, and our previous experience, so our priors, if you will, and update those through something. Another way to think about this is if you're leaning towards the neuroscience application towards AI, there's something known as a partially observable Markov decision process. You can think of it this way, that the agent doesn't have complete access to the external world. So we have to come up with a way to understand what's going on in the external world. So why do we do this? Well, that's why we named the podcast No Way Out. It really connects to the never-ending threat of entropic erosion. As agents, we have to go through this world of reorientation to avoid death. So one thing that's very important in this aspect, and something we haven't talked much about on the show, is the power of story or narrative. So our guest today knows a lot about the brain, knows a lot about story. Professor Angus Fletcher from Ohio State University. Welcome to the show.
I'm totally thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for doing this. I asked you earlier in a conversation, is there a relationship between you and a movie called SERE?
Between Seer? Yeah. So back a long time ago, we did do a movie called Seer as a kind of like fun thing. But that was kind of the beginning of this journey that I had where I got to go work in Hollywood, sort of work with a bunch of big name actors, bunch of big name studios. And that was just kind of my own process of learning about how story works from the professionals.
Yeah, I'm just curious. You picked SEER, so survival, escape. Help me out again. I went through SEER school up in Maine.
Resist, evade.
Evade, thanks. Right. So things that we're trained to do, Moose, did you go through SEER at all?
No, I was a field artillery officer in the Marine Corps, so we were taking prisoners, not becoming prisoners.
Yeah. So on our end, yeah, all aviators and special operators, I believe, have to go through SEER training. It's intense. It's pretty. You learn a lot of great things in there, and like how to resist. I think that's the most important thing. So how do you not punish yourself in an environment where people are trying to punish you? But anyway, interesting connection that I came across recently was your work on that movie, and then again, your recent work with you get to work with our special operators. Maybe some Delta, maybe some DevGru, maybe some 160th. Is that right?
Yeah, well, for the record, there is no Delta, but hypothetically, I do work with the United States Army's 2 JSOC units, for those who know what that is, and I also work quite extensively with the Green Berets.
So why would the military want somebody with your background in neuroscience and storytelling to come in and help them out?
Yeah, because basically, for years, I was kind of a rogue neuroscientist. So what do most neuroscientists think? Most neuroscientists think that the brain is a computer. And they think that the way the computers work is they're giant sense-making machines that take on all this data and crunch that data to arrive at probabilities and predictions and so on and so forth. But here's the secret about the human brain. The human brain can be really smart with limited information. And that's something that a computer cannot do. And so the question is, how is that happening? And so basically what we did in my lab for years is we said, well, actually what's unique about the human brain is its ability to initiate new actions, to do something that has never been done before, and to do it without input. And if you're a special operator or anyone else in the military, you know what that is. Yeah. You go somewhere, the plan breaks, your radio is down, comms are down, you've got to initiate action. You got to do something, Where does that come from? It comes from within. And the human brain, right down to the level of the individual neuron, what every single neuron in your brain is doing right now is initiating action. It's not taking inputs. It's initiating action from nowhere. It's the same thing that happens in a democratic society, which is like a collection of little individuals initiating action. And for a long time, people have been scared of that because they think, oh, it's going to lead to chaos, so on and so forth. But actually, if you understand how actions that are initiated can be chained together, what is a series of actions that are chained together? That's a narrative. And another word for a narrative is a plot, is a plan. So essentially, your brain is a giant story-making machine. And the purpose of those stories is to invent the future faster than your adversary. And so talking about the OODA loop, essentially what's happening in the OODA loop is your enemy's got a story and he's trying to make that story happen. He's got a narrative that he wants to impose on you. And what do? You break his story, you break his plan. And then out of the fragments of that collision, you create a new plan faster than he can and you kill him. And so that's essentially the way in which human beings can survive in chaos. That's why we can do things that AI cannot do. And that's why, as we see ourselves walking into this world increasingly of volatility in markets, in politics, in everything, humans are going to have the edge over computers.
So you're saying that we just don't simply go through the observe, orient, decide, act stage. We actually have a plan or maybe some intuition as well. So break, surprise, surprise. That's what we talk about on here is we use the 4 Ps. I'm not going to go through them today: perception, planning, and perception. Hopefully I got that all right. And then flow being the 3rd or 4th P with the PHLOW, which is actually just intuition again. So what plan does is it's internal to the system, and that action realizes that plan. So what we're trying to do with a plan is reduce risk or minimize risk based off the information we have. And more importantly, and I think you cover this in your book a little bit, and that is when we talk about planning, Moose and I talk about planning is continuous. It's always updating with the information we have from the external environment. We don't set a strategy and just let it run, hey, here's a strategy that McKinsey gave to a company and let it go. That's a bad way to plan, by the way. So the way we talk about planning, and Moose, can you bring your color into this as well as to how you explain strategy? But we always talk about building a good map of the external world, and we know that all maps are wrong. Right, Moose, you add some more to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's why the way we approach teaching Boyd in OODA Loop is so different, because we're trying to follow what he authentically prescribed and taught. That the OODA Loop sketch is merely an illustrative abstraction of how the orientation functions inside of complex nonlinear environments, which is the universe. And therefore strategy also is not linear, so that there's that illustrative abstraction, but then strategy also becomes, instead of a plan or a mission statement or whatever, it's the way he defines it is a mental tapestry of changing intentions to achieve an objective.
I'm going to add this to that, Moose. And within the OODA Loop, when we talk about the OODA Loop, we also talk about counterfactuals as far as a connection to plan, right? In stories, I believe stories would connect to that as well. Story, plot, plan, solid connection, what if scenarios, counterfactuals, COA selection. So we're always going through that process. And those that do, I hate to say planning better, but plan better. And again, it's not about developing a plan. It's about the process of planning. The higher quality planning you do, the more...
Yeah, the reorienting.
Yeah, all the time. So, Angus, does that connect to how you looked at this with your...
Yeah. So, by the way, what we talk about a lot, and first, just full disclosure, I got thrown out of the Marine Corps when I was 18 years old. And that's one of the reasons why we made that movie Sear, is I went through OCS and they were like, you're a loser, man. We don't want you here in the Marine Corps. And then Army Special Operations picked me up and were like, we want to work with you. So that gives you some indication, I think, of the relative quality zones of the Marines and Army Special Operations. But what we talk about in Army Special Operations is plan or not the plan. And so what we say is you got to plan like a madman. You got to plan out every single counterfactual. You got to go into this situation and say, what if my enemy does this? What if my enemy does this? What if my enemy does this? And you got to have counterplan. You got to get that all done in advance. And then you got to plan for catastrophic success. You got to say, what if I destroy my enemy so totally? What do I do now? What's my next move? I can't hesitate in the moment of victory. So you plan. And then the moment that reality hits, all those plans break. But it doesn't matter, because by planning, you have trained the planner.
Right.
You have increased the muscle in your brain. And we see this again and again and again. You get faster and faster and faster at doing, whatever the situation requires, if you've gone through a whole variety of those different situations. And why is that? Because you're basically practicing all these story mechanics in the brain. And that certainly maps over the OODA Loop. These are just kind of different languages. We're talking about essentially the same mechanical process, which is, what do you do in a violent environment when you have an adversary who's trying to impose their reality on your reality? And to that extent, planning isn't just about decreasing your risk. It's also about increasing your adversary's risk.
Right.
You're saying, what can I do to move risk into his domain so that all of a sudden that's starting to disrupt him, and I'm getting inside his head and he's getting inside his head. And so this is all basically, I think, out of the same tree. It's just sort of different languages and kind of vernaculars.
Right. So how do we increase their entropy while decreasing ours? Right. And that's the same. So let's go back to
destruction. Yeah, it's destruction and creation.
Yeah. Let's go back to story a little bit more and understand why, as living systems, and in particular as humans, we use story So let's build this up into two phases if we can. Genetically, I think as humans, we're predisposed to tell stories and use them for something. Um, Question to you: do animals do the same thing? And then what about culture? So can you kind of expand that a little
Yeah.
bit?
So first of all, story is not primarily for telling; it's for thinking.
Okay.
And we know this because animals do have narratives. They just don't communicate in narratives. Sort of a simple example is how we know that animals have narratives is because crows, birds can use tools. Tool use is an indication of narrative because you're basically saying, if I do this, then this other thing is going to happen. So they're telling a little story in their brain that they're able to play over and over again. If you go back to the common ancestor of the crow, the Caledonian crow in humans, that goes back before the Tyrannosaurus Rex. So narrative exists basically in the brain of any single animal that you pick. That animal is essentially thinking to themselves a story of their life. Like, I want to do this, I want to do this. When that happened in the past, this thing happened, cause and effect, that's all story. So why does culture exist? Your other question. Well, culture exists both as a repository of stories, because it's useful for us to trade stories as humans. For me to say, hey, when this thing occurred, that other thing followed. And I can give that to you. And you can say, oh, okay, I'll store that story in my mind because I could use it later. But also, more profoundly, culture makes us better at story. So there are certain stories when you listen to them, you don't just remember the story, they actually activate your brain's power to tell stories better. The classic example of this in Western culture is Shakespeare. So millions of people have read, listened to Shakespeare and gotten better at storytelling. But if you do near term sci-fi, this is something we do a lot with the operators, is we do these kinds of sci-fi stories that are set 10, 15 years in the future. The more time you spend consuming those stories, the more it makes you able to imagine things that might happen to you in the next 15 minutes, because those stories are boosting your brain's deep story thinking ability. So animals can do story. Culture exists to amplify that natural ability. Story, as we talked about earlier, is essentially just your ability to make plans, to tell a story of the future faster than your adversaries and make it happen.
Really cool. In your book, you write a little bit about, we call it complex facilitation. We use an approach called the future backwards. So starting somewhere in the future and working backwards from that. Can you talk a little bit about why forcing folks, or I hate to say forcing folks, but using that constraint to allow creativity to flow? Why does that work?
You're reverse engineering.
Mhm.
You're reverse engineering. You're going backwards from an effect to a cause. So basically, the way that narratives work in real time is they go from causes to effects. The simplest story is a cause to an effect. So
Right.
it's a beginning to an end, essentially. But what you're doing when you go backwards from effect to cause is you're reversing that natural relationship, and you're forcing the brain to pause and identify the mechanic beneath it. And there's a lot of different ways that we do this. So a simple way that we do this all the time with operators is say, oh, you've got this model. Well, based on this model, this thing should have happened, but it didn't. Why didn't it happen? And that's because your model is essentially over predictive, And so these are all different ways you have of playing things forward, playing them backwards, and sort of always tightening and tightening and tightening that model, not because that model is going to last, but because you have to practice the process of tightening faster and faster.
Okay, so a rigid predictive model probably is not anti-fragile, right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
All right. So what we're
Yeah.
asking folks to do when we talk about orientation, so orientation inside Boyd's OODA Loop, you can think of it as a world model or a generative model, right? Genetics, culture, and experience, and all the things that are connected to that. So the more rigid it is, if you want to look at like the default mode network or the way we operate or see the world, that acts as a filtering system. And what it does is it prevents you from seeing new evidence or new information of what the world actually is, right? Or what we think it actually is. So what we want to do is we want to relax that to allow you to see the world or more information, to update that orientation as we go. And story, if I understand it correctly, is a great way to do that.
That's right. Okay. So first of all, that what you're talking about there is sort of breaking your world model, whatever we want to call that world model. What that happens, according to the Army, is through the detection of something known as exceptional information. So exceptional information is basically any exception to a rule that you have in your brain. And why is it that you become interested in a story? Is because there's some interesting character or some interesting world, something that's breaking your preconceptions of what can happen, opening a new possibility. Stories, by their very nature, are not boring, right? I mean, at least stories that work are not boring. So at the very elemental level of creating a story, you've got to figure out what's a piece of exceptional information to give my audience? What's something that would surprise them and hook them and pull them out of the tedium of their day to day? This is why people who are good storytellers are very good at identifying stuff that's weird and then very rapidly tying it back to relevance. And that process of seeing the weird and realizing how it can be connected to actually kind of the ongoing flow or mechanism of life, that's also a power we see in special operators and in most kind of effective military commanders, is they're able to rapidly see, okay, that's weird. Okay, now how do I connect that to my existing plan? Okay, now that allows me to see opportunities on the battlefield that I hadn't seen before. So story helps you practice that. That's why typically when you're walking soldiers through kind of tactical or strategic training, you tell them a story of a battle.
Yeah. Yep.
And you release information a piece at a time. And the point of each piece of information is to cause hesitation, because all of a sudden it conflicts, right? Because what you notice with kind of like, I would say, sort of young or inexperienced kind of commanders or tacticians, is they very rapidly grip onto a strategy that they want to use in a particular battle, you know?
Yeah.
And what you've got to do constantly through these role-playing exercises is start to disrupt them and see, do they actually just get stuck on this plan, no matter how much information I give them? Or the alternative is, if they don't get stuck, a lot of them just freeze, like deer in the headlights. There's like, there's too much happening. And so, you know, what a good storyteller is able to do is disperse information at the right speed so the audience never gets confused and never gets aggressive. And that process of exercising those muscles, those are the same muscles that help you kind of develop a plan, right? If they help you develop a story.
But this is not just about special operators. It's about everybody. So you bring up commander's intent and make a connection to Hamlet and Shakespeare. And can you talk a little bit about how important storytelling is in the concept of commander's intent? And we call it, there's another level there. We call it mission command, right? So we have mission command, commander's intent. We call it leader's intent as well. But what is the connection that business leaders can take away from this conversation and connection to Hamlet?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say that everybody's a special operator. If I can be a special operator, you can be a special operator, right? I mean, that's like the whole point of the Green Berets, is to force multiply, is to take everybody, every regular person, and turn them into a Green Beret. To your question about commander's intent, what's happening there is you're telling people the end of the story. You're saying, this is where the story has to end. The story has to end with this outcome. Now I'm giving you, the person who I've given my intent, the ability to write the rest of the story. You're at your beginning. I've given you the end. Create the middle. And that process of storytelling is both incredibly powerful for organizations because it unleashes the creativity, the autonomy of your teams, but also because it allows them to be flexible. They're on the ground in the way that you're not. And when I see bad organizations, what they're trying to do is they're trying to tell not just commander's intent, but also the middle of the story. Right. So they're trying to say, here's where you're going and here's how you're going to get there. The moment you say, here's where you're going and here's how you've got to get there, you've just turned your human into a robot. Exactly. You've eliminated their ability to think autonomously.
So agency is removed the moment you start telling them. And so this is very important too. And Moose, I know you got some ideas in your head. I can see it. Moose, can you bring us back to the OODA Loop on this and Boyd?
Well, we're biased, right? So we've been in the Boyd archives and we know that the Army stole a lot from Boyd and called it other stuff and didn't credit it. Come on.
Wait a minute. Okay. So let me
box 14 of the Boyd archives. I've been there. I've seen it with my own eyes.
as a flunky from the Marine Corps, let me just point out to you that actually Boyd, I believe, was part of the Army Air Force originally, right? Because, you know, the Army invented the Air Force. So really, all of this stuff goes back to the Army. The Army's the granddaddy of the
No. The Army's the granddaddy of the Space Force. They're the daddy of the Air Force and the granddaddy of the Space Force.
That's an unfortunate result that maybe the Army, you know, isn't.
Well, no, just for context, though. So you were Green Beret.
No, I'm not a Green Beret. I'm a professor at Ohio State.
No, I know that, but
I work with the Green Berets.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I heard you say when you say like exceptional information, I mean, that's what we would call a mismatch. So when you're scanning your environment and you encounter a mismatch, you either have to interact with it in order to isolate it, or you're going to get isolated by it because you didn't interact with it. Well, also too, I think another thing that really resonates with me, it's no secret, by the way, you know, because maybe another episode, but we had Bing West on, and the Green Berets and the Marine Corps Combined Action Program were the two forces in Vietnam that really tapped into this.
Yeah,
that
totally.
Were highly successful. But back to the Air Force, the Army, you know, the institutional Army, the institutional Air Force, institutional Navy, the idea of aligning inside of villages and aligning with tribes and aligning with culture assimilated and working from within to push out, that was anathema to, dumping tonnage on things to get body counts, right?
That's right.
So the Green Berets and the Marine Corps, I think, have an akin to thinking that Boyd himself tapped into, because it was Andrew Krapinovich, who we'd love to have on the show, still around, whose book, The Army in Vietnam, he talked about this exact thing, but Boyd would mention that book in discussing powers of conflict. And I would think that a lot of what you're speaking about, Angus, is that when you have a cultural officer or a program like CAP or the Green Berets or others that are assimilating into, say, guerrilla forces or like a Lawrence of Arabia, you have to understand stories and you have to understand tribes, because tribes are wired for stories, and stories are how tribes communicate. And it's even how Boyd communicated. He didn't publish books, and he didn't, he did it all through oral briefing culture. And it changed every time. So I think the resonance is pretty, is pretty clear.
Yeah. And to be clear, I think Boyd's a genius. I think so. What you're talking about there when you're going to another culture is, first of all, every culture has its own narratives.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you got to learn. But also every individual within that culture has their own way of spinning those narratives and has their own narrative capacities. And so a big part of what you have to do as a Green Beret, or you got to do as a Marine when you're engaged in these exercises, you've got to get inside the head of your ally and think like them, or you've got to get inside the head of your adversary and think like that.
I mean, there's the $1 million point, is that it's all in the cognitive space. The war is always in the cognitive space.
The ultimate weapon. This is the ultimate weapon.
Well, I'm glad. So, I know your PhD's in English literature, so I'm not the only liberal arts guy here today, but that exact frame of thinking that you have to have of interdisciplinary perspective is exactly what you need to thrive in chaotic, nonlinear environments, to get out of that sort of typeset mindset. We start from the left, we go to the right. We start from 100%. The left, we go to the right.
100%.
We haven't brought his name up. I think one of the things where we've broken a lot of ground on was compounding John Boyd with Marshall McLuhan, because a lot of the things that you've been saying, it makes me think of Marshall McLuhan, and talking about how even things like the phonetic alphabet, even things like the written language and the printing press and all those things, those media have a direct effect on how we interact with our environment, how we interact. It shapes us as humans.
The media is the medium. Yeah.
The medium is the medium is the message.
Medium. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So 100% agree with all of these things. And I think the question is like, well, how do we help people get better at this? Because the thing about what we see, this is my opinion anyway, what we see is that, these are natural processes. Anyone, is born to a degree with a certain capacity to imagine like other people or learn stories or things like that. But we see that certain groups are better at it. And we also see that certain groups are better at training it. And I think Army Special Operations has an incredible training pipeline. I also think the Marines, to be honest, probably has an even better training pipeline, because the Marines doesn't have the same selection sort of process, right? So they just take everybody and train them to be a Marine, right? Whereas Army Special Operations, it's a little more.
Well, there's some nuance behind that. I mean, I would say that officers are selected.
Sure.
Marine officers are selected by Marine enlisted that train us. Marines have to go through a transformation process of 90 days at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, where you take a kid off the street, you break them down, you build them up. In 90 days, you have a Marine. What General Gray with warfighting tried to get the point across, and Boyd was there for all of this, was that being a Marine is not a thing per se. It's a state of mind. It's a cognitive operating system. It's an orientation. And that's the distinguisher, I think, between that and looking at a lot of other things. They think of the Marine Corps in technical terms, not the Marine Corps in cognitive terms, because that's really what it is. It's a way of thinking.
Well, I can tell you, just based on my own limited experience at OCS, one of the gifts that I got from the Marine Corps is the Marine Corps puts you in these threat situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go into a fight or flight response, and the Marine Corps teaches you when you're in fight or flight to fight. And it's really effective at doing that again and again and again and again and again. And I think that's a kind of training that we could benefit from giving a lot of young people, because I think a lot of young people, when they go into a threat response, are more likely to quit nowadays than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Whereas to go through basic training for the Marines is to start to understand your threat response and start to shift over to fight. And one of the things that I really loved, about my, brief contact with the Marines is, to a certain extent, the Marines don't even care what you're fighting for. They just want you to fight. Like, that's kind of the basic training, and they allow a great deal of autonomy within that, right? Because it's an American institution, right? It's not like a conditioning system, but that's the basis, really, of your autonomy, is when you get into a situation when you're really scared, you don't give up. Instead, you say, you know what, I have this other option, which is to struggle. And even if I don't know exactly where I'm going, I'm just not going to give up. I'm going to struggle. I'm going to struggle. And I don't think anyone is better at teaching that than the Marines, just like how not to quit when you get in a situation where.
And there's the SEALs would be on par, I think, but there's ways to do it where you don't even have to have. You can learn fight or flight response with breath work, and you can learn how to do it without having any time in the Marine Corps at all. But it teaches your body and your central nervous system that same response that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think this is an opportunity to really give away some secrets here on building that adaptive capacity to understanding the environment, right? I think that's what you're talking about, both of you, and that's to me, that's intuition or process or adaptive capacity. Now, we've had folks come on from ecological dynamics, talk about the perception action loop and constraints-led approach inside of sports, which you think is fantastic. Perceptual control theory. Earlier, we talked a little bit about, hey, we don't want to take an engineering approach towards humans and say that we're computers. We don't want to take the same idea, but we are seeing natural intelligence go back into AI or what we think the way the brain works through things like the free energy principle, active inference, and I brought up perceptual control theory as well. So can you help us understand how we develop that intuition, or what John Boyd called finger spitting of fuel? Okay. Yeah. So how do we do that?
You got to be prepared, however, is that I spent 10 years working in AI, and I think it's largely a hoax.
Same.
I think, okay. So, and I think that the reason that humans are smart is because we do things that AI can't do. And so I think we got to think of, so let me give you a quick example.
Let's build on that first. So Boyd brought up people, ideas, and things, right? Always in that order.
Yeah.
So things are AI. We're not going to take an engineering approach and apply it to a human system. We don't want to do that. But I think what is better is taking a natural intelligence approach, what we think we know about how the brain processes and the living things process, and try to create AI off of that. So large language models are really just the closed OODA loop, the linear basic approach to what everybody gets wrong about John Boyd's work. So we're with you 100% on this thought. And I don't think the military, the Department of War is. I think a lot of folks in there don't understand that these engineering approaches are not how we're going to win wars. So I want to put that in there.
That's how the Chinese fight. The Chinese are all in on AI because they're communists, and communism is a top-down system which is based on statistical inference.
They're technocrats.
Yes, exactly.
Well, also too, what we were talking about earlier, the difference between Green Berets and Marine combined action in Vietnam versus the institutional military that was all about body count and technology and metrics and whiz kids and all that happy horse shit.
That's right, Rob McNamara. Yeah. So okay. So let me give you a quick kind of just example of the difference between human intuition and computer intuition. So if you go back and if you read your Daniel Kahneman or you look at any computer science textbook, they'll tell you what intuition is that it's a pattern match. They'll tell you that. And there's a problem with this, which is that computers crush at pattern matching. You won't find any human that can pattern match like a computer can, but computers are terrible at intuition. They're unable to see the leading edge of the future. Meanwhile, children have pretty high intuition. Children are able to spot. I mean, this is why young kids are always spotting the next fashion trend faster than adults, right? So, there's a certain kind of prime area where you see kind of in your teens, where you're sort of like maxing out your intuition, your ability to kind of anticipate the future. That's why entrepreneurs are typically younger, yada, 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 right? That's why people who get Nobel Prizes are typically younger. All this, or they discover the Nobel Prize from there, because you have this intuition, which is not actually data-driven. What's actually happening there? Well, human intuition is the ability to spot exceptional information, which is the ability to spot an exception. So actually, intuition is your ability to see something that does not fit, not your ability to detect a pattern. It's the opposite of that. How do you train that up? There's lots of different ways to train it up. The simple and most basic way to train it up, which every Green Beret does, is just to travel. And by traveling, I don't mean, like going to a resort and eating McDonald's, in another country. I mean, literally living in someone else's house getting yourself immersed in another culture.
Yeah.
Why is it?
I have to tell you, so that actually came up at this event that I was here in Manhattan last night, where one of the exercises that Dr. Anna Newsom, who's a psychiatrist at Yale, who has been a guest on our show, and she's talking about spirituality and consciousness and these sorts of things. And she had us go through 3 exercises, and one of them was, like, what is it about you that makes you, different or distinguished versus others? And the thing that I brought up was growing up the son of a career Army officer that went to West Point, that we lived all over the world. And both of my parents had itinerant lifestyles growing up. My grandfather was an executive with Exxon, so they moved around a little bit and lived in other countries. And then my mother, her dad, who's also a Yaley like you, he was an Episcopalian priest, and they moved around from place to place. And then having that military experience as a kid, you're constantly in immersion, re-immersion. So you were learning different cultures, different languages, going to different countries, meeting. And I interacted with a lot of kids whose moms were from Vietnam, because their dads that had fought in the Vietnam War, they brought back a wife from Vietnam, or their moms were Korean. So you're constantly exposed to like other cultures and other perspectives, such that it's not like, oh, I was born here and I lived here my entire life, and that's my
Exactly
worldview.
Right.
Yeah.
And so neurologically, what does that do? It does a couple things. So like, first of all, the reason that children are so good at spotting exceptions is because they're born into a world where everything to them is exceptional. So you're essentially putting yourself back in your kind of like child state of mind, where you're constantly being immersed in a place where everything is exceptional to you. And all those kinds of parts of your narrative hardware in your brain are starting to pop in that situation. The other thing is you're discouraging what is the adult response to exceptions. So what's the adult response to exceptions? The adult response to exceptions is to do what a computer does and regress them to the mean, or to skip over them as an exception. This is what computers do. So they basically discount exceptions. They say, oh, that's an inefficiency. I need to not pay attention to that, because every second you're spending focusing on an exception is a second you're getting away from your core mechanism, your core productivity. So when we look at top executives, they spot
Taylorism, right?
Taylorism, yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's right. Yeah. I'm definitely not a Taylorist when I go to foreign countries. Don't be Taylor.
But a lot of the institutional thinkers are.
They are.
Yeah.
It's the foundation of Harvard Business School. And, by the way, I have, thanks to Army Special Operations, one of the most popular articles in HBR last year, a big feature article on how to become a leader based on special operations. But I will tell you that 99% of the world gets their business training from Harvard Business Review online, and it's all Taylorism. Yeah. And we would do a lot better to send some of those folks into some military training, or just get them to travel more. So
can you say that again? Can you say that all again? Because please, that's what we're trying to explain to folks: is get away from Harvard and learn from. Yeah.
So Harvard is great. So like, as I said, you can look this up. I have a big feature. So they publish only a few features a year. I have a huge feature. It's called Lessons on Leadership from U.S. Army Special Operations. I talk about kind of all this brain science and all this kind of stuff. So I love Harvard, love the editors there. But I will tell you, based on my experience with Harvard Business Review, is that 99% of what they publish is a version of Taylorism or organizational psychology, or all these things that grow out of Taylorism, design thinking, all these things. These are totally fine in stable environments, which is to say they're fine for managers, which is to say they're fine for being inside a company, which is data rich and its processes are not changing. The moment that you are confronted with anything new, you need to shift from management into leadership. You need to have initiative. You need to have imagination. You need to have common sense, which is something that Taylorism does not teach you. These are all things that you learn automatically almost your first day on the job in the military, because the first thing, because what's the basis of the military? It's something called inherited problems. What are inherited problems? They're problems you didn't make. Mm-hmm. United States people made a problem for you, right? Well, you're welcome, military. Take this problem and solve it. And you're like, I don't have any training in solving this problem. It doesn't matter. You better solve it, because now all of a sudden it's your job. And so you've got to get very, very quick at learning. You got to get very, very quick at opening yourself to your environment. You got to very, very quick, because you also have inherited talents, right? Which is a kind of nice way of saying you're stuck with the people who happen to be on your squad. You've got to get very, very good at identifying what their strengths are. And one of the things that I love about the military is the military almost never throws anybody away. Now, occasionally you get some people, right? They just keep transferring them around and hoping that they stick somewhere. But for most good leaders in the military are able to look at individuals who haven't been activated yet who nobody else has been able to figure out, and they're able to find out what makes them work. That's totally different from business where you just fire people immediately. So the entire purpose of the military is to identify what's exceptional in your environment, to identify what's exceptional in the members of your team. That's what powers leadership. That's what's different from management, because that's what allows you to have an edge in a changing world, which prioritizes innovation and initiative as opposed to optimization, efficiency, and just kind of squeezing a couple more numbers out of the system.
So are you familiar with One Tribe at a Time?
Yes.
And James Gant. So why didn't that catch on then? Like, why didn't that work?
In the business community, you mean? Or
well, let's start with the Army, but again, you could take the same concepts to the business community, which Ponch and I have talked a lot about and tried to demonstrate. But like, why did something that seemingly it seems like there was a thinker that was doing what you say and was pretty good at storytelling and pretty good at interacting and pretty good at dealing with exceptional information, and the model was working, but why? How did it not?
But the system didn't accept it. So here's the thing. So I don't want to get in trouble from the Army for saying this, but this is true. Is when I praise the Army, I praise the people in the Army. I do not praise the system of the Army.
There we go.
And I've spent an enormous amount of time watching all the work that we've done get thrown out of the system. So I've spent like the last couple of years with the Army getting these like just really, these phone calls from people who are like, oh my God, they just threw out this thing that we did. They just threw out this other thing that we did, and so on and so forth. And so I can't explain the Army. It's the largest bureaucracy in the entire world. It's totally dysfunctional like any bureaucracy. But what I do know is that those ideas stick around in individuals. And when individuals hit a crisis, they pull that book off the shelf and they learn from it. And that's my sense of how the military generally works, is it's unable to systematize these insights, but they kind of stick around long enough in the culture that when people need them, they get them from word of mouth through somebody else.
So do you think then that the reason that like that idea, which General Petraeus has told everybody to integrate this and operationalize this, so it was the system, because Ponch and I aren't going to disagree with that. Like, we know that systems drive behaviors. But so the system didn't allow that kind of thing to flourish.
Systems exist to perpetuate themselves.
Yep.
And what perpetuates a system is stasis. And so, the thing that I think has always been the amazing thing about the military is that it's always managed to win despite being a system. It's not the system that helps it win. And you see this again and again in the military. I mean, the smart folks that in the military always figure out ways to like bend the rules, break the rules. Everybody figures out how to kind of get it done. And, the military has this culture, which is, I think, maintained by the sort of senior NCOs, which, when the system is helpful, and sometimes the system can be helpful in peacetime in terms of getting you your funding. I mean, there are ways to play the system, to work the system, and certainly good NCOs know exactly how to do that. But the moment you get into a conflict space and the system is working against you, you just see everybody just kind of pushes it aside. And, that relies again on common sense. Because if people push the system aside and just go totally rogue, you end up with like anarchic, violent, destructive behavior, right? You end up with vigilante behavior. I mean, and there are instances of that obviously happening in special operations. But for the most part, there's a culture of special operations, which is essentially the good outlaw. You've probably heard this term before, And basically it's like, we go outside the rules to kind of respect the rules in a way, right? We break the law in order to make the law, essentially.
So a lot of the constraints or rules are designed for a complicated domain. And I think it sounds to me like you're very familiar with complexity theory, and you use a lot of unknowns and things like that. So neuroscience, complexity theory, and storytelling, the connection to AI, what I'm hearing from you is that, hey, these things are really good in a complicated domain. Humans are fantastic in the complex domain. A relationship between cause and effect is only known in retrospect. And therefore, not just intuition, but common sense allows us to navigate that complex domain. Is that ring true with you? And do you have any more?
That was an amazing synopsis. You didn't need me on this podcast. You could have just said those words,
No, we need you on this podcast. No, we really do.
What interests me is how you train common sense. And this is another thing, because like I went through, so Special Operations actually has a common sense course. They have a course for common sense. And they essentially put me through it, and I scored a negative. I scored a negative on common sense. And they were like, whoa. They're like, we get people in here all the time. Because I think a lot of young people go into the course that essentially score 0. But scoring a negative is
Well,
even by their own-
congratulations on that. That's
Thank you.
amazing.
I have negative common sense. And, of course, it's because I spent all my time in front of a computer or in a classroom. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't have the ability to make intelligent decisions when I don't have a lot of information, which is what common sense is. It's like, how do you make the right call?
Let's put a pin in that for a second. Are you saying that people that spend a lot of time in front of their computers that don't go outside and engage with the external world probably don't have a lot of common sense?
I'm telling you, they probably have negative common sense like I do.
Let's take it a step
severe
further.
Mental health issues too.
I've been told that, every village has an idiot, but the internet brings them together. So is
I think that's mostly accurate, except I think it would be more accurate to say the internet makes them.
Okay.
Angus, so here's my question then. So we're talking about dealing with complexity, and we're talking about how the Green Berets and the USMC cap and the complexities of Vietnam with a difference, in an Asian culture, an Eastern country, an Eastern language, an Eastern way of thinking, how they were able to thrive in that, and yet their dependence on what it was that was empowering to thrive was not technical, was not computers, was not munitions, it was something else that engineers don't learn the way liberal arts people do, the way linguists do, the way psychologists do, historians, et cetera, philosophers, et cetera, et cetera.
That's totally right. And I will say, however, that over the last 20 years, kids who are getting a liberal arts education are learning less of it than kids who got a liberal arts education, 40 years ago or 60 years ago. There's been a real narrowing of this. The main reason for that is, what does school teach you? School teaches you that there's a right answer and the teacher has it. And
even in liberal arts.
Well, increasingly now in liberal arts.
Yeah.
It used to be the case that you would kind of, you take a class in philosophy and then you go over to literature, and the two classes would be different. And so it'd be like going from one world to another. I mean, that's the basic idea, is that you're constantly exploring all these different cultures. But increasingly, the humanities has narrowed in on a smaller and smaller set of truisms. Why? Because the humanities is detached from reality. And so you get this artificial culture that's essentially starting to replicate itself like any system that needs, I think, to kind of be disrupted. And people are trying to disrupt that now by adding this kind of, these right-wing ideologies into it. The problem is much more fundamental than that. The problem is that it's ideological at all, really, right? I mean, the humanities should be a place where you explore different perspectives in a democratic way.
Do you think that, so disclosure, I'm of the Jesuit system, so liberal arts, and my BA was in history. So do you think that when open inquiry in a worldly view, exposing people to all those sorts of things, that when we've shied away from that or moved away from that, that actually hurts us in complexity, not helps us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. Because you've got to understand that other people think differently than you. That's it. And why do other people think differently than you? Well, it's a biological thing. Every brain is different. And beyond that, biological success comes from the ability to surprise your adversaries. So the human brain evolved to think differently because that's its edge. So anytime a human is going into an environment, it's like, what can I do differently than other people? That's like your basic thought, And so, repressive regimes try and suppress that by programming everybody and making them think the same. Whereas democratic environments say, let's use that. Let's use the fact that we're all thinking differently and figure out a way to have conversations. So a big part of a classroom, the idea there is you have conversations with other people who think differently than you. And the classroom is going to nurture those differences of perspective, not try and gain consensus, but actually allow you to understand somebody else at the same time as you remain yourself. And what that's doing is the same thing that, the Marines or, Mac v. SOG or whatever were doing in Vietnam when they were going in and building across cultures. They weren't creating Americans. They were allowing that culture to remain distinct while at the same time they were having a conversation.
Ooh, so
what do you think we've given up then? Do you think it's our educational system that's emphasized more STEM and pulled people away from those things that allow for creativity and
it's a couple
imagination?
Things. It's standardized testing, which has infected high schools. It's basically what I would call a kind of careerism, which is the idea that college exists to give you a stamp, a rubber stamp. So people aren't interested in learning anymore. They're just interested in getting the stamp. And also it's about the kind of ideological consolidation of the humanities. There was a period of time, I would say kind of a sweet spot in the 90s where you had the kind of older, more conservative humanists and you had the newer kind of more progressive humanists, and they were just like fighting like cats and dogs inside departments. But that was great for students because you could go back and forth between your 70-year-old professor who was like, let me tell you the great books and the great classics. And you could have your new professor who was like, I'm going to use some radical ideas. Now all those radical professors are the old guard and there's no new radicals. And so as a result, we just basically have this ideological conformity, and that's the death of any system.
So I'm curious about this. Within the Army, I'm sure you are aware of University of Foreign Military Cultural Studies, UFMCS, and their now defunct Red Teaming School, which was created by Colonel Rodkoff. So why did the military Army get rid of that?
Because they're insane.
Because
they're
Rodkoff.
insane. Yeah, no, I mean, this is, first of all, I mean, I don't know the individual decision makers, and I'm sure the folks that I've talked to about this have all expressed heartbreak over it. So I know it's not like, but I mean, getting rid of red teaming is nuts. Absolutely nuts. And I think everybody knows it. I mean, if you go into any sports team in America, any professional sports team, they spend all of their time red teaming. Right. That's why they're good, right? You're always trying to kind of, bring your adversary into the building to break you down. And the moment you stop doing that, and I think, there's been this whole shift, and I don't know exactly why it is, but this shift towards optimization. The problem with optimization is it gives you this idea that there's a right way to win everything. And if we somehow just get that right way to win, then we're okay, Yeah. Optimization biologically leads to extreme fragility. Any organism that's optimized to its environment is the first organism that goes extinct. Yep. The human hand, not optimized, right? Totally not optimized, right? But good at a million things, right? It's adequacy. It has maximum adequacy. And so I think, there is a culture of optimization, of efficiency. These things tend to take
over specialization.
Over specialization, all these things, right? And they're not good in militaries, and they're really, really bad for kids, which, to go back to our earlier part of the conversation, is what's the problem with schools. And they're also disasters for businesses. I mean, you're seeing now with businesses, there's this loss of growth. There's this loss of productivity. There's something called the productivity paradox, which I'm sure everybody who's a business person knows about, which is that we keep dumping technology into companies that doesn't increase their productivity because we're not accessing the human potential inside companies, and humans are becoming widgets. And
but isn't that the Vietnam example? We'll just keep throwing more money and tech and sensors at all the problems.
That's right.
Well, let me ask you this now. Is that happening now in the DOW, in the US? Are we becoming more dependent on more tech or people?
Okay. I mean, again, I don't want to speak out of turn, and I speak for myself, not for the Department of War.
Right.
But I mean, all I see everywhere is how special operations is going to suddenly get into cyber and how this is the future. And there's no question that cyber is a great tool. But the moment you start thinking that all of these battles are going to be fought in this kind of technological zone of IT and the rest of it, right? You're taking away the human edge.
Yeah.
You're taking away the fact that if you drop, and there's a buddy of mine who's who just recently retired from special operations. His name is Colonel Gaines, Tom Gaines. He just wrote a great novel called Quantum Dagger. So I'm just going to promote that here on your podcast. Sure. Go read Quantum Dagger. It's basically about a bunch of Green Berets who have to go up against a Chinese AI. And it's basically a story about how the AI is like winning and winning and winning and winning until all of a sudden catastrophic, right, problems. And so, and this is the thing is, we're losing what made America, and what made it prosperous and what made it succeed, which is this ability to be different in a positive way,
We just had Fred Stein on the show. He's the co-author of Network-Centric Warfare. He worked with Admiral Zabrowski years ago. So the bottom line was in 1999, early 2000, we were trying to figure out how to use information for the external environment. How do we improve organizational and individual performance? That got lost into, hey, we need better systems, better technology. And so this isn't changing. That's what I'm getting at, is no matter how much we push people, ideas, and things, the systems can be driven towards things. Technology.
Yes, the systems want the things. And there's no question that intelligence is really important. So if you get great surveillance on your adversary, that's incredible, right? If you can get eyes inside, that's incredible. But the problem is, increasingly, the more we've shifted to tech, the more we've lost human intelligence, which is way more valuable than surveillance intelligence. I mean, if you look at this operation that just happened in Venezuela, that was essentially a single human on the inside, which gave us all of that information. And you couldn't replicate that with 1 billion satellites spying and spying and spying.
What do you think of, like, say, 9/11, where 19 guys with box cutters, they defeated the system with all the sensors, all the satellites, all the tech, all the security, everything.
But humans are always going to beat systems.
And then that led to a more rigid system now, right? I mean,
and now we all have to do this insane thing at the airport. We all take our shoes off for no reason. Like, there's no one putting a bomb in their shoes. And yet I guarantee you over 1 billion shoes have been removed and scanned for no reason whatsoever, because the system has decided this is how to keep people safe.
Yeah. Unless you have TSA pre.
Right. Well, that's a way for the system to extract money from you for its stupidity, right?
Yeah.
Right, for its own
Yeah.
survival, as you
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you don't then foresee? I doesn't sound like it. I mean, guerrilla warfare will still work.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. And when you're fighting a conventional army, you're going to use conventional, response to some extent, right? Because that's how you balance and pause it. But then the guerrilla warfare is what allows you to get inside and disrupt and create chaos inside. So in any conflict, there's going to be guerrilla warfare. It's just a question of how much. And you do need some conventional response. I mean, if China shows up with thousands and thousands of warships and planes, we need some way to knock those down. We can't just all of a sudden be running around. You got to balance your enemy to some extent, but you can't rely on that to create victory. That's just going to get us back to World War I and a stalemate and this kind of two giants just basically engaging in a war of attrition, and that's a disaster.
I want to get your thoughts on this. We talk a lot about being in World War III now. It's a cognitive war. It's happening, the battlefield is our mind. So fifth generation warfare, PsyOps. How does your work tie into that?
Yeah, well, I did, in fact, work quite a lot with PsyOps units inside special operations, as you might imagine. And, to your point, essentially, what you're trying to do there is you're sort of trying to win the narrative. You're trying to figure out how to win the story. And if you can win the narrative, if you can win the story, then you get people on board without fighting because they realize that they've already lost and they realize that you've already won. And I think for a long time, and
that's Sun Tzu. That's
yes,
Boyd.
exactly. Sun Tzu. No, I totally agree. Yeah, yeah. And now but the problem is that people don't understand what a winning story is anymore.
Why do they? So you're saying that they always want to see a trigger pulled or a bomb fly. They don't realize that you could, like we're seeing some of the X posts now. It looks like there's going to be a deal on whatever, but there didn't have to be a shot fired. There didn't have to be a life taken.
Well, what I think it is I think the military in most cases would prefer not to pull a trigger, but I think that they don't know how to make the stories effectively. And I think that they always default back to doing what they do well, which is pulling a trigger, because it's easier to pull a trigger. I mean, it's easier to send in Delta Force, hypothetically, if they exist, than it is to come up with a counter narrative that shifts South America onto our side. And the reason for that is because, when you look at how people use narratives nowadays, they don't engage with their audience. So they're just telling a story of how I, the storyteller, want it to be, as opposed to engaging with my audience and figuring out how to connect with them. The reason that after the Second World War, the reason we were successful at rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Japan, is we were able to find narratives that worked for those countries. And as a result, they became huge economic engines, which then boosted us.
Oh, what a great point. So Ponch and I were just talking about this in our little gap there about Charlie Protzman that was talking about how MacArthur brought over all these statisticians and whatnot to really reinvent the Japanese economy. But what it was a fusion of respecting their culture with sort of the greatest hits of Western culture. Whereas when I heard you just now say, it's a lot of time we're going around to enforce our culture or our template on something where it can't even flourish anyway. And all it does is create more conflict.
I mean, we all know this was the story of Iraq. We went in there, we then ripped out their entire operating system and tried to replace it with our kind of operating system. And then the result was ISIS and chaos. And what you got to do is you got to go in there and say, what story is being told here? How do we make that story better? Because we're America, we make everything better. We have Hollywood, right? You give us your story, we make it better. That's what we do, And we could do that again and again and again. And when people see a story that's not only better, but also possible. Because, a lot of what happens with, I would say bad stories, the stories like emanating out of Russia or wherever, is their lies. So, they say, oh, things will be better, but they're not possible or they're not going to happen. Whereas America creates better stories that can work. Like that's the key. Another name for that, right, is a plan, is a strategy. You've got a good commander when they give you something that's ambitious, an ambitious narrative, but it can work if everybody just gets on board. And that's what motivates people to try hard. And we've gotten out of the business of doing that. Instead, we're trying to sell quick fixes and big fantasies.
Yeah.
And if we go back to this narrative project, like you're talking about, as you're calling World War III, if we go back to this project and say, all right, what can we actually do to get on the same page as everybody in South America? How can we build a story of what it looks like to have an America, right? What would that look like? How would we all gain from that? What are the steps we've got to take? That's a future which can happen. Whereas, what we're doing now is we're not putting in that kind of like deeper psychological work,
Yeah.
and we're just trying to drop systems on top of things and act as those systems can fix
So,
things.
Angus, how familiar are you with Dave Snowden's work in complexity theory and Cynefin and narrative? Are you
Yeah,
familiar?
I'm relatively familiar. Yeah.
Okay, so we've worked with them in the past, and the idea is to amplify the stories that you want and dampen the ones you don't, right? So as leaders in a complex environment, we want to collect those narratives of stories that people are telling each other at a water cooler or what have you. So this is fundamental. What you're telling us is consistent with what we've heard from others. It's consistent with what we understand on how the brain works from both neuroscience and cognitive science, and it's very consistent with sports too, right? You don't want to go in and impose your approach onto the context. You want to understand the context first, understand where you are, right?
Why are the Seahawks doing so well this year? Because they had a coach come in and activate these latent narratives inside all of those players. The players are basically the same. The coach just kind of helped them find that bigger story.
And that's the role of a leader or a coach, and a coach is a leader, to do that. So I don't know anything about the Seattle story. Can you go a little bit more now that we're going to be coming up on Super Bowl or championship weekend?
I just mean that they have a relatively young coach who does not have amazing new schemes, does not have anything particularly special, but just went in there and, rebooted what Pete Carroll had there before, and was able to find a way to get everybody to buy in collectively, particularly on the defense. The idea, if we just do this, this is going to work. I'm going to tell you a narrative of the future. And any good and effective coach is going to come in there and say, here's your story. And I'm going to tell your story to you so well that I teach you things about yourself that you didn't know, but that you realize them as yours, right? That's what a good coach does, is they unlock something about you that's true. And you're like, okay, this guy knows me. And then he says, now I'm going to do it like Shakespeare did. I'm going to take all these different characters and I'm going to put them together in one play. We now have one play, and that one play is going to connect us all, and it's going to be better than the other guy's play because all of us are going to be connected into this one play. Whereas the other guy, he's got half the guys on board on their play, right? But he's telling the other half, he's trying to force them to conform to the play. And so good leaders elicit the narratives, the stories, the lives of the people in their organizations, combine them into a larger narrative that's going the direction the leader wants. And that kind of organic process is what leads to victory.
Yeah, you ready for this? I want to switch it up a little bit and talk about the market, because we follow a lot on the market in here, and we know that there's always a narrative as to why the market went up or down, right? The day we're recording this is 20th of January, we had a pretty big down day in the market. And the narrative was, I think, Greenland, and everybody forgot about what was going on in Japan with the yen and everything going on there. So why are narratives so important in the market, and why are they always wrong? I'll give you that thesis.
Well, okay, so we've already talked about broadly why narratives are so important generally. I mean, a narrative is making you think that you can see the future, is essentially what it's saying. It's saying, like, here's the effect of this cause. And so the moment you lock in on a narrative and say that this narrative is true, then, and if that narrative's negative, you're like, sell. That narrative's positive, buy. This is fundamentally misunderstanding how narrative is supposed to work in the brain. The purpose of narrative is not to tell you what's true or even what's probable. The purpose of a narrative is to multiply possibility. It's to increase the action space. And so really, as a successful investor, you want to go into the market with 5 different possible narratives of things that could happen. And then you want to be able to kind of rapidly shift between them, or because you've got those narratives, you want to be able to be more able to come up with a 6th or 7th or an 8th, right? Once you've got those initial 5. And so I think the problem is that most investors don't understand how narratives work. And so they get caught in them. But if you're losing money, somebody else is probably making money.
Yeah.
So even if the market is going down, there's probably still somebody out there who's making money off that downturn. And that person is the person who's able to see more narratives than you.
I mean, try this. If the systems drive behaviors, then it's probably a good thing for those that are making money off of you losing money to tell you a narrative. Right? So the talking heads.
I totally agree. Yeah, no, and that's what systems do. Systems try and create narratives, and they try and make it seem like those narratives are fated or predetermined, because that shifts all the power into the system, and it takes all the power out of you, because then you can't make your own story.
Let's get a little bit uglier here, if we don't mind, and that is get back to the cognitive war, the AI space, the access to more information flow. And I want to include in that the our attention spans and maybe memes. How do they all work in this cognitive war that we claim we're in right now?
What they're doing is they're disrupting our ability to make our own narratives. So computers cannot think in narrative. This is a mechanical fact, and they will never think in narrative. I can explain this to you in technical detail, but basically computers think in equations, and equations cannot be narrative. So because computers think in equations, they also think in associations. That's why when you go in your news feed on your phone, it's always just like flashing you a whole bunch of stuff, that it associates, this word, this keyword makes it think of this article, makes it think of that article. The more time you spend interacting with computers, the more time your brain starts to respond like they think. And so you lose your narrative capacity and start thinking associationally, which is to say you're thinking in this space of constant distraction and things that are just tangentially connected because they have a word or an image in common, and that destroys your common sense. It destroys your ability to maintain and sustain an action over time.
Okay.
So what we're seeing, particularly with young people, is they're spending so much time on technology, they can't make plans for their own lives. And if you can't make a plan for your own life, you go into a threat response faster, you panic faster. When you panic, you look to somebody else to give you a plan. And so that's why young people are becoming more and more deferential. Same thing if you're spending too much time on your computer staring at the market, you're seeing all these lights go off, that's decreasing your ability to make long-term plans. The good investors that I know usually make 2 or 3 major investments a year. So I know a lot of investors who have values in the billions, and they usually do not go on and make 45 trades in a day. They usually will make a few trades over the course of a year because they're building that long-term plan. And then when they see that moment for high leverage, they go all in.
Trend followers.
Yeah. What about tribalism? So is this, you said when children can't think for themselves, they're looking for somebody to think for them, right? So is that partially explained?
That leads to tribalism. Yeah. So let's talk about why this is a normal behavior in children and why it becomes, bad in adults. So what you want from a child is you want someone who is aggressively exploring their environment, who takes a lot of initiative and is constantly pushing the boundaries. But the moment they get into danger, you want them to immediately listen to you. And so the way the children work is they're constantly happy, going around. But the moment that they get scared, or the moment you say, you yell at them, they immediately go into a threat response, a flight response, which makes them susceptible to doing exactly what you tell them to do. So you see children become submissive very quickly the moment they get scared. The reason that happens is because the brain has a bias to action. The brain always wants to be acting. It always either wants to be generating its own actions when that's okay, or taking on an action that works in the outside world. Now, what happens when people form into tribes, essentially, where they all share the same narrative, and that tribe that gets divorced from reality, is because they're all essentially in a state of group fear. It's another way of saying that is herd behavior. Why does herd behavior happen? Well, because a shock occurs to the system. People have been living inside the system for so long they can't think outside the system. Therefore, they can't come up with plans for themselves. Therefore, they just take the plan from the next person. And then they all take the plan from the next person. Then before you know it, they're all acting the same way, and they're a herd or they're a tribe. So that's where that comes from. And the moment you see a group of people just acting the same way, you know that on some level they're in a state of shock.
Or they're subject to a PsyOp.
Yes. PsyOp exists to create shock, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the way that a PsyOp is effective. Now, I will say the most effective PsyOps actually tell the truth. And there's a small number of really effective PsyOps that go in.
Tell us more about that.
Well, what I mean by this is so I've been going on and talking a lot about why I love America on this podcast. And just to be clear, I'm an immigrant. I'm a naturalized citizen. And so when I say America, I mean that I chose to become an American. I'm one of those people that gave up my own citizenship to become an American. And I think when you talk to, if you talk to people who are, refugees from, the former Soviet Union, Soviet blocs, whatever, you discover a certain kind of person who really, really likes America. And, the reason we really like America is because America gives us the chance to tell our own stories. And so the most effective PsyOps, I've always believed, is to go out to the rest of the world and be like, here's why America's actually better. Like, we're not actually engaging in propaganda here. It's actually better. Like, the food here is actually better, right? The opportunities here are actually better. Like, we're not saying that there's unlimited opportunities or it's magic or the streets are made of gold, but we are saying it's better. And so the most effective PsyOps has always been, we are better. And that's why I think when you look at Germany and Japan after the Second World War, we were able to convince them of that. We were able to show, look, we are actually, what we're doing is actually better. Get on board the democracy train. Get out of the, the fascist systems that you're in, get in the democracy train. So the most effective PsyOps always lean into that. Now, I've seen a tendency in PsyOps to lean into fear, because if you can get people to be scared, as we've talked about, you can get them to kind of do what you want in the short term. So there's a tendency in PsyOps to not lean into America is better, and instead lean into, if you don't do what we tell you, you're going to die. Your commanders are going to murder you. I've seen a lot of kind of like anti-ISIS kind of PsyOps, which is all about how, terrible things are going to happen to you if you stay in ISIS. But the most effective PsyOps is always, here's the true story of what will happen if you become an American. Your life will get better. Your children's lives will be better. And the only thing that requires us to do as Americans is live up to the American dream and keep making America better, you know? And I think at the moment, we're sort of we're at a rocky patch here, you know? And it's unclear whether the next generation of Americans is going to be better off than the current generation.
It's interesting, the remark about PsyOps being about truth. It's interesting to me. I would always thought it like a PsyOp would be about influence.
Well, yeah, but what's more influential than the truth? Like if I come on here and tell you that, so like there must have been moments in your life when someone sat you down and told you the truth and it prompted a conversion experience in you. They're like, whoa, because you realize, like, I mean, the first time you read Marshall McLuhan, maybe, or whatever, right? Or the first time you read about the OODA Loop, right? I mean, the most profound and sustained moments of influence come from somebody revealing the actual nature of reality to you.
What do you think then when you see? I mean, I would say like social media is a really good example here in the United States, particularly when there is a chasm between two sides that seem to be heavily influenced, but saying the opposite thing. So then how would you square for that? Because, you know, it as I look at it, I don't know if I call it a PsyOp, but it's certainly an influence operation that you could get people to look alike, think alike, dye their hair the same color, put in the same septum rings. And on the other side, have the same hats, have the same American, whatever. Like
I totally agree. But what we're talking about there is, again, that these are individuals who are caught in a state of shock and purposelessness and despair. I mean, if you're spending all your time doom scrolling, it's pretty easy to get influenced. And what I'm talking about here is, first of all, let's start to influence the people who really matter, right? You know, the people who are not doom scrolling all the time. And second of all, if you can start to influence the doom scrollers in a positive way, then they stop doom scrolling because they're not going to be on social media anymore because they're going to have found a deeper truth. And, you know, there's different versions of that deeper truth. I believe in science. I believe in democracy. You know, I believe in America. I believe in these kinds of things. These are the things I think we should be bringing to people. I believe in the OODA loop, you know, I believe in these guys. And I believe that the more that people find these durable narratives that are true, and when I say that they're true, what I mean by that is that they actually work in reality. You know, they make your life better. They help explain the nature of reality more effectively. They give you more power to accomplish things you want to accomplish. I mean, that's what, you know, an effective narrative is. And I think what you see in social media is a lot of people who are lost because they're spending so much time on social media that they've lost their own momentum.
Do you think it's more complex though? Like where there's certainly mental health is certainly an issue.
Sure.
SSRIs, you know, diet. I don't know. I mean, is it more nuanced?
Yeah. Okay. So to your point, yes, there's a lot of factors that are contributing to the rise of behavior. But I do think that just in general, the more you use social media, the more it pushes you in that direction that you're already going. It would be better if people ate better. It would be better if people exercised more. These are all important things. I don't disagree.
Yeah. Let me ask you, like, again, it goes back to the medium is the message, right? All media work us over, and all media are an extension of some human function. So here we find the electronic media, social media is an extension of the human nervous system. And the suggestion would be that when you look at it and get a sampling, the human nervous system doesn't look like it's in very good shape.
I would definitely agree with that assessment. Yeah.
Got a question about podcasting now. This is kind of interesting. In the last few months, Moose and I have noticed that people are watching more of our YouTube videos. They're watching more of the conversation. They are listening to it. So if that makes sense. So my hypothesis is that they are looking for connection. That in the near future, if we do see the growth of AI and people become less human, if you want to go call it that, they'll be looking for more connection. So how do podcasts fit into the world of storytelling and narrative?
What I think is really great about podcasts is you get individuals talking honestly from a range of experiences. You can have pretty niche podcasts that allows them to be honest, candid, explore things that they're experts in. And, you know, the problem increasingly with the way that big media is it has to appeal to a broad segment of people, which means it can't do anything actually interesting. And as a result of being unable to do anything interesting, you're not going to actually change anybody's mind. And you're not going to be able to connect with anybody on a deep level. I mean, when I first started working with special operators, the first thing I did was I started listening to tons and tons of military podcasts. And those podcasts changed my life because all these folks would come on and start talking about their real experience in the military. And I was someone who, before I started, when the Army first called me, I was like, I'm not working with the Army. I'm not working with a bunch of killers. What are you talking about? I'm a professor. We don't like the Army. We don't like the military. And then the more I started listening to these podcasts, the more I started realizing, no, I've completely got the military backwards. Like, I don't understand any of this. And I do think that podcasts provide people with that opportunity to explore, to discover, to find things that are different, that are interesting. I mean, I'm really glad that you guys are doing the work that you're doing, because, I mean, if you'd asked me in a million years if there would be a podcast dedicated to the OODA Loop, that would never occur to me. But I mean, I think it's genius that you guys are doing it. So that's what I think. I think it's a place for people to come together and learn from experts in an authentic way.
The great thing is we'll never run out of content, because the OODA Loop to us, it really represents how living systems interact with their environment. Not a decision-making process. And I think a reason we want you on the show is to make sure that military leaders understand that the way they look at the OODA Loop, and I'll give you an example. NATO just put out a document a couple of weeks ago on cognitive warfare, and then used a linear approach to the OODA Loop, even though they had the correct sketch in there, a really good version of it. But what they're saying is, hey, this nonlinear thing that we're talking about in cognitive warfare, it disrupts this linear thing called the OODA Loop. And we're like, no, you're actually, you're doing this wrong. You need to use the nonlinear approach to OODA Loop, and that'll open you up to understanding peak performance, flow, strategy, the Toyota production system, AI, large language models, which are, again, the linear OODA Loop, and then the next generation of AI, which looks like it's active inference or something connected to 3 or 4 dimensions, which is really what the OODA Loop is. So there's so many aspects, I think, military leaders get wrong about this thing they claim they know so much about. And you can see it on every news channel. They'll come out and say, we got to disrupt their OODA loop. And sometimes they'll get the acronyms wrong too.
Well, what I'd like to say there is probably our military is just kind of doing a little bit of a dodge there. They don't want to put the real truth out there in public, because, backdoors, they've got to, keep the OODA Loop to themselves. That's what I'd like to think. But I mean, look, yeah. I mean, the moment I went into special operations, everyone's like, oh, you got to read Clausewitz. Nobody in special operations reads Clausewitz. Clausewitz is brilliant. Everybody should read Clausewitz, but nobody does. So, I mean, to a certain extent, there's always a small group keeping the torch alive. That's just always how it's going to be, I think, in these environments. And that's
we call them, when they've written a lot, you can see it on the Substack, the guardians of decay.
Yeah.
That they make sure that the entropy is well in place. Like,
there's plenty of them out there.
But it's almost like in markets, it's the whole Keynes versus Hayek. Well, Hayek was right, but he lost. Why? Keynes was more influential. It's the same thing. Clausewitz say versus Sun Tzu. I mean, Boyd eviscerated Clausewitz. He debunked it. The entire thing. Yet still, it's the canon.
Yeah, but I think Keynes read Shakespeare. Is that correct?
Keynes read Shakespeare. Yeah, I mean, everybody, everybody who has an idea has read Shakespeare, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Yeah.
Do you find, so you're a professor of, in the English department, and as I mentioned, being a liberal arts guy, I almost officially minored in British literature. Are people gravitating towards the English department, the history department, the philosophy department in state universities?
No, so just like a quick thing here. First of all, I love English departments, and I could only exist inside the English department, even though I'm not really an English professor, right? I'm like this crazy neuroscientist. And so I think we should put all the money in the world into English departments. But no, in my department, we basically have the same number of majors as we have professors practically. And that contraction has happened over the last 10 years. Like, we've totally imploded. We've lost almost all. And I'm being essentially moved over to the business school. Business school.
I think that maybe you probably have more situational awareness than I do, but was it that in state universities, like the bottom major was mine, history, then philosophy, literature, linguistics, whatever. But like number one in state universities was exercise science.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had for a while, like the biggest major here was like communications, which is kind of a little bit of a pseudoscience, to be totally honest. And I think in general, the challenge, as we've talked about before, is that people don't really come to university to learn anymore. They come to get a certificate.
Yeah.
And if you're going to learn, you got to go into a classroom where you don't know anything and you're prepared to get a C. I mean, that's really the only way to learn. And if you don't have that, then what you get is this kind of slide towards students going into classes where they know they're going to get an A, and then they're not being challenged too much, and then everything just kind of homogenizes.
You sound like most executives in organizations is they don't want to learn anything new. They just want to be told what they already know.
That's exactly right. That's why they're so successful, obviously.
Right. And that's
really,
why,
what else do they have to know?
And the consultants that you do that are no longer useful because AI can, a large language model can tell a leader what they already know.
That's exactly right. I love that, by the way.
Do you think that universities, because you hear this all the time, that it's less of an education or open inquiry or learning, it's more of an indoctrination?
I don't think it's really not an indoctrination in the sense that I think everyone's pretty skeptical about what happens inside universities, but I think it's an indoctrination in the sense that everybody realizes that they kind of have to go along with the ritual, and pretend like they learned something. And, I think to that extent, there's a kind of like giant kabuki theater thing happening. It's the university.
Yeah.
What I would say is I think universities are going to come back. I think people have had enough.
How so?
Well, the fact that they moved me over to the business school, basically what the business school is saying is they're basically saying, we realize that AI has basically replaced most of the instruction that we've been doing here for the last few years. We've got to figure out something new. And what did the business school, which is the most successful unit at Ohio State, decide is new? They decided what's new is what I'm doing, which is basically the humanities. And they're like, we want to basically bring in someone who's going to teach our students to think smart in low information environments, to be able to tell effective stories, to role play, all these kinds of things, which are really based on the humanities. So my sense is that there's going to be a bounce back because I think people have started to have enough. From our moment, it just seems like, oh my goodness, where can we go? But there have been plenty of periods in history where there have been these kinds of blips and weird things that have happened.
Do you think so? This is what I wonder. I could take right now, my master's is in economics. I could take right now and create a full-length graduate course on Google Notebook LM using publicly available PDFs of things that I read. Is the university in that sense, is it proving that it's to your point about more of a certification or a rite of passage versus a actual authentic learning, because you can get everything online for free right now?
Yeah. So this again goes back to what I really took out of the special operations pipeline, because basically the whole thing about special operations pipeline is like 5% is instruction and 95% is experiential learning. Like once we give you the instruction, we're then going to force you through these exercises again and again and again. And that's what we're trying to do at the business school. And I think that's where you're going to see colleges start to come back, is you need to have an experienced, essentially trainer in the room. Yeah. And, I'm going to give you the slide from the econ deck or whatever. And then I'm going to say, okay, you've got your company started and your investors have just walked away because this thing just happened. What do you do? And then you're like, oh, well, I do this. And I'm like, well, you know what? Your stocks just doubled. Now you have all this extra cash. What are you doing with that cash? Right. And we start to basically role play these scenarios and put the economics into an actual simulation environment that allows them to practice before they get to the real world.
It sounds to me like your business school recognizes that non-technical skills are more important in this environment than anything else. So you're going to want to look at the interactions, which includes leaders' intent, telling the story, understanding how to leverage cognitive diversity through those techniques such as red teaming. Right.
Yes.
So where I'm going with this is everything that this age of AI is doing to us is forcing us to go back to becoming more human. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly right. That's always kind of the way that history works, is we kind of go in one direction and then we're like, okay, yeah.
So you need some experienced trainers and people that may have lived in special operations or in a world of low information who have experienced things like teaming, red teaming, who understand flow, who understand the OODA loop. And I'm just kind of throwing this out there. As,
who understand sacrifice, suffering.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's best to learn from those people who have experienced that. And it sounds to me like it's a good thing to learn from those that come from the military that have that background in teaming, in distributed leadership, in understanding complex adaptive systems, right?
That's exactly right. And we have a bunch of special ops and military instructors that we use. And, the only thing I would say to someone who's in there in the military, who's thinking about trying to, get into business or something like that, is business is going to attempt to socialize you into thinking like a business person. I see this happen all the time with folks when they transition out of the military. Is they get this moment of like fear and they're like, oh, I've got to like do what the civilians are doing. I'm going to like figure out how to fit into the system. And when you do that, you lose your edge.
Yes.
And, the folks that I've seen be the most successful in their transitions out of the military, a lot of them, what they do is they start their own businesses. They have this kind of, entrepreneurial thing, or they're able to be brought into a business where they're actually listened to and, their experience is respected.
So I'm gonna add to that. Sometimes we see folks come from the military. They jump out of the cockpit and they say, "I know how to do this flawlessly." They use effects-based operations. They use things that are have bounded applicability and say, "This is how it works everywhere." We're saying that's not true, right? So that's what Moose and I have done with the show, and what we've done with Substack is said, "Hey, look, these things have context." And I think you talk about maybe let's go back to the Cynefin framework. So in the center there, you have confusion, which has, I think you wrote about this in your book, not necessarily these words, but when you know you're confused, that's a good thing. And what we call that is aporetic or aporia. And that's actually saying, I am not applying the wrong method in the wrong context. It's just saying, I'm pausing right now because I don't know where I am. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now you've got to, I would say, once you get into a state where you realize you're dealing with unknown unknowns, which I would call is kind of the ultimate form of confusion, when your anxiety is kind of off the charts and you're sort of like, there's so much happening here in my environment that I don't know. What you got to do in that moment is you do got to take a pause and say, is there someone else in my immediate environment who I trust, who knows the way? In which case, absolutely learn from them. But if you look around to right and left and there's nobody, then, run ahead. And I think that, my experience with military individuals is they're far more emotionally comfortable with that experience than most business people. Business people freeze. I did actually, so I go around.
Unpack that more, because I think that's a very incisive point.
Well, I just did a training the other day at a very large company that will remain nameless. And so a lot of what I get asked to do now is go around and kind of, talk about these kinds of special operation mindsets. And I'd gotten 3 words into the talk and I was interrupted and they were like, please don't use negative words. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, you used the word failure. Like, please don't use that word here. And I was like, why would that? It's like, well, because negative words create negative thinking and then negative thinking creates negative outcomes. I was like, no, it's the opposite. First of all, if something is bad and you say that it's bad, that's called reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I think actually, when I experience what happens in a lot of businesses is they practice things that I would call dissociative. So they basically, when something bad happens, they just pretend like it didn't happen. We're not going to have a hard conversation right now because we're going to pretend like that thing just didn't happen. This is endemic I actually have to teach classes on how to have hard conversations in businesses because people won't do it. Whereas if you go to any military environment, they're like, what do you mean hard conversation? I just yelled at that guy. He yelled back at me. Then we hugged it out. And we went on and then we yelled at each other some more, and so all of those, what I'm talking about in terms of the level of emotional comfort, what I mean is that you've been in the situations, not just hypothetically, but you've been in the situations. And you understand that you have a capacity when you're confused to continue to act. You understand that you have a capacity, even when you hate the guy next to you, to talk it out and then bond tighter over that and then become brothers. You understand that emotionally. It's not just a conceptual thing, but it's something that you've lived. And I think, when you start to bring that, which I would call wisdom, I would call lived knowledge wisdom. When you start to bring that wisdom into businesses, it does tend to make people nervous because people in businesses actually have not experienced very much of the world. And they spend a lot of their time being concerned they're just going to get fired or made redundant, And so the idea of acting with initiative is very low on the kind of order of emotional comfort.
I was in asset management for 15 years after the military, and I once got told, I used to basically drive my business by teaching how to integrate John Boyd's thinking into building your business and your markets and things like that. I'll never forget this one portfolio manager who told me, he says, if this was important, it wouldn't have been taught in the military. I would have learned it at Harvard. So don't waste my time. I'd be like,
yeah,
cool.
By the way, I mean, something about elite institutions, which I think anyone who's been at an elite institution can understand, is they're very self-regarding, just like
they're
that.
very vulnerable.
When you're self-regarding, you're very inward-looking. When you're very inward-looking, you don't learn. And you essentially just become very conformist.
Yeah, they're closed systems.
There's a closed system. And so actually, when you're at Harvard, the safest assumption to make at Harvard is that you're actually not learning very much. Now, you're getting a great badge, and you're surrounded by a lot of other folks who probably have a lot of money and so on and so forth. But the more you're in those institutions, the less you're probably learning.
Yeah. Do you think that those, I think, again, as tech just gets better and better and AI just gets better and better, I really think that a lot of those sort of old-timey institutions that don't adapt, that they're a lot more vulnerable than they realize.
Oh, yeah. And I think that some of them are starting to realize it, actually.
Yeah.
I think there's this thing, but again, it's that we don't know what to do. And when you don't know what to do when there's a problem, You just pretend like it doesn't exist.
They just double down.
Or you double down on what you're doing. Yeah. But I think basically what you're seeing is a kind of creeping fear and anxiety that's infusing these places. And it's so intense they can't even acknowledge it. Whereas,
You're Angus, when I hear you say that, I reminded of Boyd. Well, in Patterns of Conflict and in Organic Design, he says that, basically the way it's always been is like, we just put a fresh coat of paint and a new name on what we've always done, and we'll just tell everybody we're doing something different, but we're not really.
Yeah.
So I wonder in earnest if those institutions are actually making the right changes. I haven't looked at the military academies in a while, but I know that I remember reading that a lot of the humanities were getting purged out in favor of STEM type topics. And I thought that, well, how are you going to lead people, and how are you going to interact with people by getting rid of humanities?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I would say that the military academy they have a certain kind of, like horse sense about them. And once they realize that they need kind of more people leaders, they're going to put the humanities back in. With these other institutions like, Harvard or wherever, what I would say is I spend a fair amount of time across the pond, because, I was born there, in England, and Cambridge, Oxford, those institutions are on the verge of collapse. But they're actually on the verge of financial collapse. Yeah. I mean, it is really bad over there. Really, really bad over there. And so I don't think we're that far away from some of the same problems starting to hit American institutions. I think that really the only thing keeping most of them alive is the goodwill of their alums.
Yeah.
And, it's not there. I mean, if you took away the alums and you tried to sell most of these colleges to students, most of them wouldn't go.
Yeah.
So I think, we are at a moment where there's gonna need to be a change. And to your point, yeah, the humanities. I mean, philosophy, literature makes you smarter.
Well, so I asked that because when I think of the old curriculum at West Point, again, I'm biased to West Point only because my father went there and I was raised to be that, and I was the black sheep going into the Marine Corps on a Naval ROTC scholarship. That they, in the old days, being a cultured officer was like a hallmark of an officer. So that you had to learn French, you had to take art classes, you had to learn Shakespeare. In fact, the Shakespeare book that I have, the complete works, is my father's from West Point. I have his actual complete works. That was his textbook there. So, I mean, it was a thing. And it seems to me that it's always like, for practical purposes or for measurement or for metrics, we're getting rid of that stuff, and we're going to be doing something else.
Yeah. Well, let me just give you an example from, my own cultural background, which is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill essentially invented special operations. He was the guy who basically invented the commandos, and that we sort of kind of got on board with that. And Winston Churchill, I think, is also generally acknowledged to be a pretty good leader and someone,
his mom was from America. His mom was from right here in New York City. So go ahead.
So my point being is that who is his favorite author? Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And, and the reason that Shakespeare is good is not because Shakespeare is amazing, but because Shakespeare includes the richest diversity of characters. That's the whole point about Shakespeare. I think people get Shakespeare wrong when they think, I've got to memorize and understand him. No, the point is just that no one has a variety of individuals like Shakespeare. So the more you read Shakespeare, the more you're just exposed to different ways that different people can think.
Well, stay on your topic there. So that book, I'm sure you've read it, about the ungentlemanly conduct or whatever it was, that Churchill's gentlemanly, like his special operator book. It's something called his tribe of ungentlemanly men or something like that.
That sounds about right. I don't know the title. But
I'll look it up before we go.
Yeah.
But basically, the point of the matter is that to your point, these guys that were in the intelligence world, the special operations world, the commando world, the OSS world, these were high cultured men that Ian Fleming based James Bond after, right? I mean, these were
only if you wrote about this in your book.
But these were not necessarily pure technicians. These were cultured men. One quote I saw something like, he could be sabotaging disarming a bomb in the morning and dancing with a double agent female at Monte Carlo at night. Like they had this range. But how do you get that range without liberal arts? I don't I
You
don't
don't.
know. I don't know how you
You
do
don't.
it.
You don't know. I mean, because the point is that it increases your imagination while also increasing your common sense. That's the duality that's really important. It gives you a broader sense of what can happen, right? You just start to see life is full of a lot of possibilities that I didn't learn
Yeah.
about in math class, right? There's because I mean, all of special operations really is just going outside the existing channels, going outside the box, just saying I'm just going to move beyond the system. So there's that, but then also the common sense thing. I mean, when you read Shakespeare, at the end of the day, you got to figure out how to make it work. I mean, that's the thing about Shakespeare. Like, how do I actually make this? I got to stage this, I got to make it work.
The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It's
a great title.
Oh, and it's going to be a movie coming out. How about that? I can't wait.
But yeah, you get those things from books, essentially, from reading books and having conversations about those books with smart people, not from math. Math is great. I don't have any problem with math, but you got to develop the other side of your brain.
How many of those guys too, like that were Oxford dons, like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, weren't they were also war fighters too? Like they had been in
the Tolkien was in World War I, actually, and we think, so actually the first screenplay that I ever sold in Hollywood was on Tolkien in World War I. That was I sold it to Bob Shea, the guy who did Lord of the Rings.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So yes, to your point. Yes, there's a long history of that. Now, I don't want to make it seem like somehow if you read Shakespeare, it automatically makes you a great officer. There's plenty of bad officers who have read Shakespeare, but the point is it helps because it does help stimulate that ability to realize that there are just different ways of seeing the world, different people. Shakespeare, one of the most famous things that he did is he didn't just write comedies and he didn't just write tragedies. He wrote both. Prior to that point in history, he wrote history plays, of course. He wrote romances, sonnets. Up to that point in history, it was thought, no, you've got to specialize in one kind of story. And he's like, no, I can tell lots of kinds of stories. And again, that's what it is to be an operator, is to be like, I can tell lots of kinds of stories.
Did you have there was I just blanked. We were talking about Shakespeare. There was something else I wanted to say about reading. I was going to add, Norman Dixon's the Psychology of Military Incompetence.
Oh, right. Yes. I actually did read that book very quickly. That book is a little bit outdated. It's got, I forget exactly. It's got like a very narrow sort of like psychological explanation for everything.
Well, no, he was a psychologist that fought in the British Army in World War II. But then he was a trained psychologist. So a lot of it was his inquiry, like, why were these incompetent guys in command of us as we were all getting slaughtered on the beaches or whatever it was. And it's it's the same year as me. And Destruction and Creation, John Boyd, 1976. So it's 50 years old now, but the book is two parts. And it's all British military escapades that he puts in it. But you could cross out military incompetence and you could put university incompetence, or you could put neuroscience incompetence, because the concepts seem to hold across disciplines. So I don't know if you'd ever looked at that.
Yeah, well, there's no question that the failure of almost any individual is a failure of imagination, or a failure of common sense, or a failure of intuition, or a failure to understand your own emotions or the emotions of others. I mean, these are the basic problems, and they do recur across organizations, and they certainly occur in the military.
Do you find that with a doctorate in literature, and now that you're in the business school, do you find that leaders are even reading authentic, good literature, even if it's, so much of literature, I guess, over time is, various degrees of politics, but do you find that people are even reading Hemingway or Kerouac or Tolkien?
What I find is the most successful leaders generally are.
Yeah.
But in general, MBAs are not. And so there's a kind of interesting thing there happening where I feel like we're essentially training a management class as opposed to a group of leaders.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can bring this home for us today. Thank you for your time. But can you tell us a story about what a future leader who is looking back at the failure of their organization 6, 9 months, 12 months down the road, what they should be taken away from, why they failed, and what they could take away from the things we just talked about?
I would say the main thing is learn from the military and run an AAR. Run an after action review, get everybody in and tell the honest story of what actually happened. Because the reason that most people do not learn from failure is they tell themselves the wrong story. They tell themselves the story that makes them feel good about themselves, that pushes blame away from themselves. Tell the true story of why you failed. Get everybody in the room together to tell the true story of why you collectively failed. Have that honest moment, and you will develop true wisdom, which is what the military does every day.
I can't think of a better way to wrap this one up because we're strong advocates of effective debriefing, retrospective AARs, understanding what happened from multiple perspectives. That's what John Boyd would say too, because everybody has a perspective on what happened. Nobody really understands the true reality. Therefore, we can understand the what, the how, and the why. And I think that why gets us the first principles. And I think that's what makes your book Primal Intelligence and your book on creativity and other writing so powerful. So, Angus Fletcher, thank you so much for being here today. We're going to stop
Thanks a lot.
recording. And before we do, where can our listeners find you on the web and what's coming up next for you?
I'm pretty much the only Angus in Ohio, so you can just Google that. Yeah, you can.
Except all the cows. Except
all the cows.
Yeah.
Or just look up my book, Primal Intelligence. It's now a national bestseller, and it's published in like about 20 different languages. So if you don't read it, you'll be missing out.
Thank you very much. We'll keep you on here for a few moments.